Welcome back. Time for business with our business editor, Owen Fairclough. Hello, Owen. Now, we're going to start off with a look at that European Central Bank's credit fest. It's raising fears of a new banking crisis.
It was inevitable, perhaps, Claire. It's been just too successful for many people. Remember, this is the second one in almost as many months, the second time that the European Central Bank has made available very cheap loans at virtually giveaway interest rates for the Eurozone's banks, and they snapped it up eagerly under the new figures released yesterday. Another 500 billion euros was lent out by the European Central Bank, this time to around 800 banks, so more banks taking on this kind of money. And inevitably, it leads to the question, and that classic image is the doctor giving the patient too much morphine and basically getting the patient addicted to this. There's concern that these Eurozone banks are going to get addicted to this cheap credit and find it very difficult to wean themselves off this kind of thing 3 years down the line when they'll have to pay back this money. And it raises these fears that perhaps Europe will run itself into a new banking crisis right at the point that it's just trying to emerge from one. Of course, it's helped countries like Italy and Spain, but this latest round of long-term refinancing is particularly worrying the Germans. Catherine Gillam has more details for us.
Practically giving away money for a second time in an effort to stem the European debt crisis. The European Central Bank announced its first LTRO, or long-term refinancing operation, in December. An offer to loan Eurozone banks money for 3 years at an ultra-low interest rate of just 1%. More than 500 banks borrowed over 489 billion euros, a flood of cash that some say has boosted confidence.
Financial markets and the banking sector are indeed recovering. The risk of a credit crunch is receding thanks also to decisive action of the ECB.
For many, the first LTRO has been a success, encouraging banks to buy sovereign debt, lowering borrowing costs for debt-racked countries like Italy and Spain, and enabling banks to loan money to businesses and consumers. Others say the operation hasn't provided the intended trickle-down effect.
The idea that the long-term repo operations have eased the supply of finance to small businesses in the euro area is a myth.
The ECB has flagged up that its second LTRO could be its last. It doesn't want Eurozone banks to become dependent on its support and hopes the onus of tackling the debt crisis can fall back on governments.
Now, if you look at the markets, it seems they haven't really gone for that move by the ECB at all.
Yeah, it's a difficult one in many ways because it should give the markets a lift. And yet the trouble is when you get so many of these banks taking up this money, it makes investors think, well, how bad are they really if they need to snap up all of this cheap cash? As you say, the European markets finished Wednesday's trade down, and the Asian markets have picked up on that sentiment as well this Thursday. Let's give you those numbers there. The Nikkei around 0.5% off, just the Shanghai Composite and the Kospi making some inroads on Thursday's trade. The US market, similar kind of picture. A lot of investors a bit sour-faced, basically, because the US Federal Reserve has taken a look at Europe and said, well, we're not going to do too much of that anytime soon with any more quantitative easing. All the markets on Wall Street ended the day between 0.5% and around 0.7% up. Luckily, we've got Apple that is keeping things ticking along very nicely. Apple has joined what they call the 500 Club in the US, just a handful of firms that have a market capitalization of over $500 billion. It officially hit that threshold on Wednesday. You can see there the share price as well, absolutely going through the roof. Over the last month or so, it's increased more than $100. Shares in Apple are now trading at around $540 a pop. Lots of expectation. When is there not expectation about Apple? Because it's rumored that Apple is going to unlaunch its latest iPad next week, the iPad 3. So expect some big excitement for that.
It seems Apple can do no wrong.
I know, I said they were unstoppable at the moment. You just look at those numbers and absolutely phenomenal. But remember, companies like Microsoft had that kind of performance around 10 years ago and have tailed off a little bit since. So.
All right, let's now catch up with a few more of the day's leading business stories. James Murdoch has quit as chief executive of News International, leaving his family with no direct involvement in UK newspapers. Murdoch stepped down amid shareholder pressure for News Corp to distance itself from the phone hacking scandal that led to the News of the World tabloid shutdown. James Murdoch's activities will now focus on News Corp's pay-per-view TV operations.
Veolia's chief executive has fought off a boardroom coup. Antoine Ferraud won the board's confidence following reports that former boss Henri Poglio was leading a campaign to get rid of him over the company's declining performance. Veolia is expected to report losses of around 200 million euros later this Thursday. Ferraud is trying to stem the damage by selling off 5 billion euros worth of assets.
And the UK's Supreme Court has delivered a ruling that should help Lehman Brothers creditors recover their investments. The High Court says Lehman must divide up cash that belongs to clients, including money it mixed with its own. Lehman had kept around $2 billion of client money separate, but it's thought to have had far greater sums merged with its own accounts when it collapsed in 2008.
Okay, next here on Business, redrawing even Europe's car-making map. The tie-up between GM and Peugeot here in France is the latest transatlantic partnership in the auto sector. GM has bought a tiny stake in its French rival, but it belies the significance of an alliance that both of these car makers need to keep their European operations going.
A partnership aimed at keeping costs low in a competitive European market. The alliance will see General Motors take a 7% stake in the struggling French automaker Peugeot Citroën. Both companies have been hit hard by a sluggish European economy, a slump in car sales in the region, and cutthroat price competition. GM's European operations, which include the German carmaker Opel, lost over $700 million in 2011. Peugeot's core auto division was almost 500 million euros in the red by the second half of the year. The two car companies say they will share vehicle platforms, components, and modules and create a joint purchasing venture. An overall streamlining that will lead to an expected $2 billion in annual savings within 5 years, shared between the two companies. Both automakers say they will continue to sell their own vehicles independently.
So 2016 for the potentially for the new or first GM Peugeot car to come off the production line, Claire. As I said before, it really does redraw the map here in Europe because Peugeot is really the last French car maker to actually jump into bed with another rival in terms of sharing components and so on. If we take a look at the map of European car making, remember you've got Chrysler and Fiat also making cars together now. Fiat, the majority shareholder there with Chrysler, and making now Italian cars for the American market. Remember Renault and Nissan, they've had a tie-up now for the last 10 years, and that's always cited as an example of a company that was struggling in the case of Renault and managed to turn its fortunes around very quickly with a car-making partnership that took it to the Far East. So Peugeot and GM, it's by no means unusual doing this. It's just the latest, but it's also a big shift for a company like Peugeot, which, let's not forget, was a family-owned company. You don't get that many of those left in Europe anymore.
Ultimately, though, Peugeot has to think beyond Europe. Yeah,
of course, this was designed, this alliance, to give these companies basically to bolster their presence in Europe. But as you say, Peugeot has virtually no presence in the Far East, never really managed to crack the Chinese market. GM, remember, is selling cars in countries like China, has a big presence there. And this is the idea that Peugeot can perhaps tap into a bit of know-how with GM and ultimately try and get its cars to be sold in places like China, the most lucrative market for car making these days.
All right, thanks very much, Owen, for that look at the day's business news, and thank you for watching. Stay tuned. All the latest headlines with Stuart Norval in just a couple of minutes.
France 24 presents The Observers. Get a different view of the news. Yours. Photos, videos, and on-the-spot eyewitness accounts verified by our journalists and published on our website.
Welcome to the France 24 Observer.
The Observers. It's also on TV, with webcam reports from our observers around the world. The Observers, an interactive network of some 5,000 people. The Observers. It's them, it's him, it's her, and you can be part of it. Find out how at observers.france24.com. You too can be our eyes across the globe.